Welcome to the debate. When a massive bridge is failing, the crisis is entirely visible,
Oh, absolutely.
right? If you walk across it, you can physically see the stress fractures in the concrete. You can, I don't know, see the rusting suspension cables, the sagging steel beams.
Yeah, the structural engineers can point right at it and say exactly what part of the infrastructure is giving way.
Exactly. But when we look at the architecture of the natural world, well, the signs of collapse are far more elusive. We are dealing with an infrastructure built over millions of years.
And the fractures aren't in concrete.
No, they happen quietly. They are in the disappearance of a specific marsh bird or, the fading of a seagrass meadow or just the silent, invisible warmings of a coastal current.
Exactly. And the terrifying thing is, unlike a bridge, you can't just pour more concrete to fix an ecosystem. When the ecological architecture fractures, it triggers these cascading failures across entirely different systems.
Right.
It's not just a tragedy for nature enthusiasts. We are talking about the very foundation of human civilization quietly liquidating itself.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today. As we observe the International Day for Biological Diversity, or IDB 2026, the world is really grappling with the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
The KMGBF, yeah, a huge undertaking.
Huge. It's a landmark agreement that lays out 23 specific targets to halt ecological collapse. But a deep fracture has emerged in how we actually achieve this. This is drawn directly from Mission Green, which is a project exploring our current environmental protection strategies.
And it poses a really difficult question.
It does. The central question we are exploring today is this. To halt the civilization-scale crisis of biodiversity loss, must our primary focus and hope lie in mobilizing local, community-level actions? Or is this crisis fundamentally a systemic failure of global economic architecture that renders grassroots efforts inadequate without massive top-down reform?
That is the crux of it right there.
I argue that localized, community-led stewardship is the indispensable foundation of ecological recovery and the only force capable of turning global diplomatic promises into actual environmental transformation.
And I maintain that biodiversity loss is fundamentally a macroeconomic and structural crisis driven by global finance, international trade, and misaligned incentives, meaning bottom-up, local action is vastly eclipsed by the ongoing liquidation of our natural capital.
Okay, so let's start by looking at what is actually working on the ground right now, because I think it informs this entire discussion.
Sure.
Nature isn't a machine. You can't just tune it with a macroeconomic wrench from some corner office building. It is a living web.
Well, obviously.
And a living web has to be maintained at the granular, local level. I mean, this year's IDB theme is acting locally for global impact. And it relies on three very specific pillars: look and learn, connect and act, and share.
Which are great awareness tools, sure.
But it's not just about raising awareness. It's about physical, localized intervention. Let me give you a very tangible example. Take the dugong.
Ah, the sea cow.
Right, the world's only fully marine herbivore. For decades, we saw them drifting toward extinction. This was due to boat strikes, net entanglement, and most importantly, the massive loss of the seagrass they graze on.
Yeah, they were disappearing incredibly fast.
But recently, they were brought back from the brink in places like the Gulf of Mannar and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And if you listen to this, you have to ask yourself, well, how did that happen?
I imagine you're going to say it wasn't the politicians.
It wasn't. It wasn't through high-level financial restructuring in Geneva. You have billionaires and diplomats writing checks and passing resolutions, but the actual mechanism saving the species is a local fisherman in the Andaman Islands wading into the water to hand plant a single blade of seagrass.
Okay, but
Let me just finish this thought. They recovered precisely because local communities physically restored the environment. That is the essence of the Global Biodiversity Framework's decisive shift toward rights-based, community-led conservation. The global diplomats are finally recognizing that local action is the primary engine of success.
right.
Without the people in the water planting the seagrass, the policy is literally just paper.
Look, I understand the emotional appeal of the dugong story, and local conservation is certainly a beautiful thing to witness. I really don't want to diminish the hard work of those communities.
But you're about to.
No, I'm just saying we have to zoom out. We have to look at the sheer scale of the macroeconomy we're up against. If you're planting individual blades of seagrass while a fleet of industrial dredgers is right behind you ripping up the ocean floor, what are we really accomplishing?
I mean, you're preventing localized collapse.
Are you? Let's look at the staggering evidence surrounding our global economy. More than $58 trillion of global GDP depends directly on nature.
Which is a massive number.
It's totally incomprehensible. And it means the economy does not sit alongside the environment, right? It exists entirely inside it.
Agreed.
Agriculture, water for cooling, data centers, pharmaceuticals, tourism, they are wholly dependent on natural capital.
But the structural incentives are entirely inverted. Think about this for a second. Governments are publicly committing to conservation at these global summits, yet they are simultaneously spending between $470 and $600 billion annually on harmful agricultural subsidies.
Right. We hear that number a lot, but I think people struggle to connect it to the physical world. Then let me break it down. What does a $600 billion agricultural subsidy actually look like on the ground?
Go ahead.
It means farmers are literally being paid by the state to over-fertilize their fields. They are receiving tax breaks to clear-cut rainforests so they can grow subsidized soy or graze subsidized cattle.
Okay, yes, the incentives are bad.
The economic incentive is to destroy. That single policy contradiction directly drives 14% of global deforestation. So while I applaud citizen science bird counts and urban gardens and local tree planting drives, focusing our hope there is structurally insufficient.
But
we are dealing with political and economic incentives operating on short-term growth cycles that treat nature as a free input. We are watching entire rainforests turn into dry savannas.
yes, but
We are watching coral reefs collapse on a continental scale. You simply cannot stop a $58 trillion economic liquidation with a community nature walk. It demands redefining how modern finance and development operate.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. You're viewing the environment as an accounting ledger, aren't you?
I'm viewing it as a system.
You're suggesting that $1 billion of destruction simply erases $1 million of conservation. But biology operates on the butterfly effect.
Oh, come on. The butterfly effect?
Hear me out. A tiny local change, like protecting a specific coastal wetland, can prevent massive, unpredictable regional consequences. Let me offer a way to conceptualize this. If you're looking at a forest, compare local biodiversity actions to the root system under the soil.
Okay.
From a macroeconomic perspective, looking down from a satellite, those roots are completely invisible. All you see is the storm of global industry battering the canopy. You see the bulldozers.
Which are doing the actual damage.
But when the storm actually hits, that invisible, localized root system is the only thing physically holding the soil together. When local communities restore a habitat, they are creating immediate, highly specialized resilience that top-down policies simply cannot manufacture.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
All right?
Your root system analogy assumes the soil itself isn't being systematically excavated by those same bulldozers. Let's use an analogy that really captures the fragility of the system.
Let's hear it.
A healthy ecosystem is like a house of cards. Every species, every soil microbe, every climate pattern, and every top predator is a card holding the structure together. If you remove enough crucial cards, the collapse spreads rapidly. Right. And what local conservation tries to do is carefully, meticulously, place a few cards back at the bottom of the structure. But the global economy is violently shaking the table.
So you're saying the scale of destruction outpaces the local repairs?
Exactly. We know that ambition consistently outpaces implementation at the state level. Governments sign pledges, they pose for photos with indigenous leaders, and then they fly home and continue to prioritize short-term GDP growth.
It is frustrating, I'll give you that.
If the table is shaking, local wins are reduced to mere rhetoric. By the time a local community manages to stabilize one small ecosystem, a macro-level temperature shift in the oceans alters migration patterns, and that causes fish populations to crash entirely years later, the community did everything right, but the macro system wiped them out anyway.
But if we agree the table is shaking, and I do agree with that, we have to look at how we actually stabilize it. And stabilizing the table requires localized mechanisms.
How so?
You argue that the financial system is too massive and works against us, but the transition to nature-positive economics is already underway, and it is fundamentally driven by granular local action. We're looking at an opportunity projected to generate over $10 trillion annually and create around 400 million jobs by 2030.
Doing what specifically? Where are those jobs coming from?
Through ecosystem restoration, circular economies, and regenerative agriculture. And let's be clear about what regenerative agriculture is, because it gets thrown around as a buzzword a lot.
It really does.
It's not a policy you write in a boardroom. It is a localized physical shift. It means a farmer stops tilling the dirt, which releases carbon, and starts planting cover crops to bring the biological life, the microbes, the worms, back into the soil.
Right.
You can't mandate that from the top down and expect it to work without the farmer fundamentally changing their relationship with the specific soil they stand on. These are inherently localized activities.
I don't disagree that regenerative farming happens in the dirt. But let's talk about the money required to fund those 400 million jobs and local actions.
Okay.
Let's look at Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Target 19 explicitly outlines the need to mobilize $200 billion annually for biodiversity protection.
A huge sum.
Right now, as we sit here, current commitments fall below 10% of that need. 10%. So who holds the power to close that massive gap? Not the local communities. And this brings us to a glaring structural inequity, the North-South divide. Wealthy nations are historically responsible for most ecological damage, yet they chronically fail to meet financing commitments to capital-poor, biodiversity-rich countries. We see this most sharply in the debate over digital sequence information, or DSI.
Wait, let me stop you there. Digital sequence information. If you're listening to this on your commute, you might be wondering how a $58 trillion economic crisis connects to digital data.
It's a huge piece of the puzzle.
For our listeners who aren't geneticists or trade lawyers, how exactly does a corporation digitally extract a physical plant from the global south? Walk me through how this biopiracy actually happens on the ground.
Absolutely. It's a vital mechanism to understand. So imagine a multinational pharmaceutical company based in Europe. They send a research team to a megadiverse region, say the Amazon rainforest.
Okay.
They find a rare frog or specific medicinal plant that local indigenous communities have used for centuries to treat pain. The company doesn't need to harvest 1 million frogs or chop down the forest to take the plant.
Because they just take the DNA.
Exactly. They just sequence the DNA of that organism in a lab. They turn the physical biology into a digital code, put it on a secure server, and send it back to Europe. Then, they use that digital sequence to synthetically recreate the active compound, patent a highly profitable drug, and make billions of dollars.
And what goes back to the community that protected that forest?
Absolutely nothing. Zero. The local megadiverse communities are entirely powerless against this. This is structural biopiracy. They protected the forest. Their knowledge guided the discovery, but global trade law and intellectual property regimes heavily favor wealthier actors.
It's a serious issue. Yes.
It proves that the fight is inescapably top-down. How can local stewardship succeed when the very building blocks of their biodiversity are being digitally extracted and monetized without their consent or compensation?
That is a critical concern, and I'm glad you laid it out so clearly. But I would argue that this exact issue actually proves my point about how global policy is finally bending to empower local custodians.
Really?
Yes. You mentioned DSI and biopiracy as if it's an unchecked inevitability. But let's look at what happened at COP16 in 2024. The establishment of the Kali Fund is a direct structural remedy to exactly this issue.
The Kali Fund is a mechanism, yes, but...
Let me explain how it works because it's genuinely revolutionary. Think of the Kali Fund like an international royalty check. Just as a musician gets paid a fraction of a cent every time their song is played on the radio, the Kali Fund mandates benefit sharing from the use of digital sequence information.
In theory.
In practice. Now, if that pharmaceutical company uses the genetic code of that Amazonian frog, they have to pay into this fund. And the entire purpose of Target 13, which the Cali Fund supports, is to ensure that those profits flow back down to the indigenous peoples, the local communities, and the biodiversity-rich countries that actually steward those resources.
If the funds actually reach them.
The global mechanism is actively being rewired specifically to empower the local level. The money is being routed back to the root system.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the glaring policy contradiction happening in real time?
Which one? There are a few.
The hypocrisy of state financing. Let's look at Target 22 for a moment. Target 22 recognizes indigenous people as key conservation partners. And you're right, COP16 was famously branded the COP of the people.
It was.
The diplomatic language is wonderful, but let's contrast that with Target 18. Target 18 demands the reduction of environmentally damaging subsidies by at least $500 billion per year. As we discussed earlier, governments are still pumping up to $600 billion into the harmful agriculture that drives deforestation.
Right.
So you have a situation where a government publicly praises its indigenous custodians at a COP summit. They maybe send a small stream of benefit sharing from the Cali Fund, but simultaneously, they use their national treasury to finance the very industries bulldozing those indigenous lands.
It's a massive contradiction. I agree.
It's more than a contradiction. It's an impossible battle. Local stewards are being forced into a fight against their own government's treasuries. They cannot win that fight through grassroots resilience alone. The macroeconomic reform, shutting down that $600 billion pipeline of destruction, has to come first, or at least concurrently, to stop the bleeding.
I don't disagree that the subsidies must end. They are perverse incentives. But waiting for international finance to perfectly align before we prioritize local action is a recipe for total ecological collapse.
I'm not saying we wait. I'm saying
The treaties move slowly, but biology moves fast. Look at the cornerstone of the framework, the 30 by 30 target. That's the goal to protect 30% of land and oceans by 2030. A national government can draw a green line on a map and call it a protected area, but if the local community isn't engaged, if the indigenous people who live there aren't empowered as the primary custodians, it just becomes a paper park.
sure.
It looks great on a diplomatic ledger, but the forest still gets logged illegally.
But without enforcement from the state,
Enforcement comes from the community. These global goals are realized at the edge of the network, where humans interact directly with nature. If a community implements sustainable harvesting, they are actively buying the planet time.
buying time, maybe.
They are keeping the ecosystem functioning while the complex, sluggish machinery of global finance, trade law, and subsidy reform catches up. Without those local actors holding the line, there won't be any biodiversity left for the macroeconomy to save.
But my argument is that the local actors are being fundamentally overwhelmed. Let's consider the mechanics of a tipping point. Mission Green clearly outlines how ecosystems are approaching irreversible thresholds.
Yes, the tipping points are terrifying.
The Amazon rainforest isn't just losing a few trees. It is nearing a tipping point where the entire regional water cycle breaks and it turns into a savanna. Pollination systems are failing globally. These aren't just isolated local problems. They are systemic cascades. You mentioned the butterfly effect earlier, a small change having a huge impact. But that works both ways.
How do you mean?
I mean that a small temperature shift in the oceans alters migration patterns. Suddenly, a coastal community's incredibly sustainable, perfectly executed local fishing practice is rendered completely obsolete because the fish simply aren't there anymore.
Well, yes, climate impacts.
The local community did everything right. They followed the pillars. They looked, learned, connected, and acted. But the systemic macroeconomic failure of climate regulation wiped out their efforts anyway. This is why I insist that treating biodiversity as an environmental issue to be managed locally is a misdiagnosis. It is a systems crisis touching finance, political order, and global health.
It is absolutely a systems crisis. I concede that entirely. But how do you actually reform a massive, entrenched system? The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is often called the Paris Agreement for nature. And just like the Paris Agreement, top-down edicts fail without bottom-up buy-in.
They do, but
Every community garden planted with native species, every farmer switching to regenerative soil practices, every neighborhood demanding greener cities, it all aggregates into the political pressure necessary to force the structural changes you're demanding.
I agree that bottom-up buy-in is necessary, but we have to be brutally honest about the hierarchy of power here. A neighborhood demanding green spaces does not easily dismantle a $600 billion subsidy apparatus entrenched in national politics and corporate lobbying.
It's an uphill battle.
I am looking at the core contradiction explicitly defined in the analysis. Political systems and economic incentives operate on short-term growth cycles, while ecosystems operate on long-term ecological limits. Until that specific misalignment is resolved, nature will continue to be treated as a free input to be exploited. If we don't pull those macro levers, we are just managing the liquidation of natural capital. We are just making the destruction slightly less bad rather than stopping it.
I think this is where we need to pull our perspectives together, because we are circling the exact same threat from two different altitudes.
Fair enough.
In summarizing my position, I return to the idea that while global economic structures are undeniably daunting, ecosystems are not balance sheets. They are living webs bound by countless invisible threads. It is the localized, community-led interventions, like the physical restoration of seagrass to bring the dugong back from the brink, that build the immediate, localized resilience necessary to keep nature functioning. Local action isn't a lesser form of engagement. It is the physical mechanism of survival, while international policies work through their contradictions.
And to summarize my view, I maintain that relying on local action to fix a $58 trillion economic misalignment is fundamentally fighting a symptom rather than the disease. We can and should celebrate the return of a species in a specific bay.
Exactly.
But until we close the massive $200 billion biodiversity finance gap, until we eliminate the hundreds of billions in harmful agricultural subsidies, and until we stop the uncompensated extraction of digital sequence information, the table will keep shaking. We cannot rebuild the house of cards from the bottom up while the macroeconomy is actively tearing it down.
Yet, despite our different angles of approach, there is a profound point of convergence here. Listening to you, it's clear we both agree that biodiversity loss has graduated from being a niche environmental issue to a critical systems crisis.
Without a doubt.
It is inextricably linked to global finance, food security, public health, and climate stability.
Absolutely. We are both looking at a paradigm where current political short-term growth cycles are catastrophically misaligned with long-term ecological limits. Whether you are trying to plant a mangrove in the sand or trying to rewrite international trade law in a boardroom, that temporal mismatch is the shared enemy. Growth built on ecosystem depletion is not growth at all. It is self-destruction.
And the blueprint to address that self-destruction is laid out in the 23 targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. As the world approaches COP17 in Armenia in October of 2026, the real test is implementation. We highly encourage our listeners to examine these 23 targets for themselves to decide where the true battle for our planet's future must be fought.
We have to decide if we are going to keep shaking the table or if we are finally going to let the house of cards stand.
Or perhaps if we are finally going to let the roots hold the soil. Thank you for joining us.